Hello and welcome to another episode of Literary Gladiators, the show where we discuss debate literature in all of its forms. If it's written work, it's game. Let's meet the panel.
Hi, I'm Larry.
Hi, I'm Renny.
I'm Ari.
And I'm Josh. And Renny, welcome back to our panel for the 10th season of our show.
Pleasure to be back.
It's a pleasure to have you back. Renny had some standout performances in The Wasteland and Titus Andronicus, and we can, it's very hard to not forget our previous discussion about Titus Andronicus. For so many reasons. But, oh, yeah. But today we're going to be going over a work of World War I poetry that that Ari suggested.
Again.
Oh, no. We're going to be doing it 3 times, so again. But
I meant because we did World War II poetry, now we're doing World War I poetry.
We went over, earlier this season, we went over Break of Day in the Trenches by Isaac Rosenberg. We're going to be going over Wilfred Owen later, but we're going over For the Fallen by Laurence Binyon. And that was your selection, so you have a discussion starter?
I do have a discussion starter. This is a tribute to World War I, like fallen soldiers of World War I. That's basically what this is. This poem is basically based off of, and it was supposed to be about. But I think that this poem has become much more than that. I think it's become more, and I don't really have a discussion question. This is more just a discussion statement to kind of start a conversation. I have seen the bits of this poem, different bits of this poem, used for things that are not war related. So I remember that, like, the line that says, "They shall grow not old as we are left to grow old."
That's the 4th verse, and the 4th verse has become standard for memorials.
Right, and I think that, as you said, memorials, it doesn't always apply to war memorials, because I know in Jewish tradition, we every time there is a death, in our version of the English memorial service, no matter if it's a war death or otherwise, we always use the line about how we remember them, and it was kind of adapted. So I just think the discussion I want to start is that I just think it's very interesting that this has gone beyond what it was intended for, and because it was so well written, not just that one line, but the whole thing was well written, that it's kind of become it's become a memorial for everything, and not just the war.
I think you have a good point. I think that it does fit the war mold very well, because he does make good points on the fact that when we think about fallen soldiers, we see them as still being very spry and active, and yet when they fall, it just happens like that, and they're here one moment, gone the next, and we get that image in our head. We don't get that image of them aging like you or I do, or even veterans that survived do. When you think of a World War II or a Korean War vet, you think of somebody older in age. When you
like
think
like a POW, like John McCain. He passed away in old age, and frankly, he did amazing things, like very proud things. When you think of someone, you don't think of someone like older. You think of someone who in this.
McCain was Vietnam, but you're on the right.
I was just pointing out.
Well, that reference to the agelessness, when I first read it, I thought of Antony and Cleopatra, because he says, age will not stale her.
Oh, I was looking.
The same reference. Yes, they are frozen in time. I used to do them in high school. Rupert Brooke, Wilfred Owen, the war poets. Because World War I especially tends to get lost today.
Yeah, it produced some of the greatest literature, because it was a great turning point. It was a different kind of war.
I remember when I was at Cherokee, I had to write a short story about the Christmas armistice, like a fictional story. It was had to be based off of a very famous. The assignment was world cultures, and the assignment was write a short story about a non-fictional event, but make it fiction. And
this,
that's the
this was a
rendering.
world cultures class? Or?
Yeah, and we had to. We did not choose what we got. We picked it out of a hat, and we had to research it.
That's an intriguing assignment, and
So
that's the route to historical fiction.
I wrote a story about how a soldier was literally about to get into this major battle. Like a bunch of soldiers had to get into a major battle with each other, and basically every couple seconds of every couple lines, I would go into another person's brain and see what they were thinking. Like, oh no, mommy was like my mom was this, or oh, I'm gonna miss my girlfriend, or whatever, something like that. And then as soon as it's over, everything just stops, and everything they start. It's Christmas. Why do we have to do it this way?
Oh, okay.
In the World War I poets, and some for World War II, like Randall Jarrell, they went to war. They were in the war. They
Wasn't
didn't just
Owen in the
write
war,
about
too?
the war.
Yes.
Yes, he
Owen was in and he
Yes.
died in the war.
Yeah, and so did Brooke. Yes.
Isaac Rosenberg.
Yes.
Laurence Binyon was too old to join the war, but he engaged in
Yeah, he wrote this
plenty
in
of effort.
14, just at the very beginning. He
Yeah.
joined the Red Cross. That's what Hemingway did in the United States, too.
Yeah.
He was also
Yeah,
part
that
of
was
the
what,
London Regiment.
Oh, what
Well,
was
we
it? Was it
didn't-
Call to Arms? That's what that was about. I think it was called.
Farewell Arms.
Farewell.
Farewell to Arms. Excuse me.
We didn't enter till 1917.
Yeah.
Britain was in for the duration.
But at the time that this poem was written, several soldiers had already been killed.
Oh, I'm sure,
Yes.
yes. He wrote it on the Cornish coast. I thought that was interesting.
But this is the one. This had an immediate impact. It wasn't like works of poetry and works of literature that it takes time and particular recognition.
Well, no,
and
because
notice.
of it was
Yeah.
written for that time, and it
Mhm.
was, when you go to Europe, on every corner there is a statue to the Great War. It is not World War II, it is World War I. That is the war that disrupted Europe. It ended most of the monarchies, it changed almost all of the governments.
In a way,
It was-
World War
it was
I caused
huge.
World War II.
Yes, it
Yeah.
was a huge change.
Mm.
And it was also the change from the romantic ideal of Hector and Achilles on the plain of Troy, because you were being mowed down by machine guns and run over by tanks and hung up on barbed wire. Those were all new, terrible things that were introduced.
But the reason that why World War II came about is because World War I ended so sloppily. The way that the treaties and the placing it all on Germany.
Well, we also didn't even end World War I. There's a little program that runs on New Jersey's PBS called Drive-By History, and actually we signed a treaty for World War I in Bridgewater in 1921 because we wouldn't sign on, the Senate would not sign on to the League of Nations, and that was in the Versailles Treaty, so we didn't sign it.
Not to get political, but Woodrow Wilson, people see him as as an impactful president, but I feel he was very overrated between this and the instatement of income tax and the growth of federal government and the growth of the reignitement of the KKK.
Do you mind if I mention some things I actually enjoy about this poem?
Yes.
Absolutely.
So I think some of the wording in here, like the words used, are more, what's the word? It's not simple. They're very complex words that describe exactly what Binyon is trying to say about the war, instead of it just being general words. Like, they're very specific words. Like I really like when he is saying, there is music in the midst of desolation and a glory that shines upon our tears. I think that he's specifically talking that there, even though everything is kind of, people have passed away, there is still memory.
Mhm.
That is there. I don't think you can really take
I
any other
think you
message.
can pair stanza number 2 with stanza number 6, because
The innermost heart of their own land, they are known as the stars
Because-
are known to the
More
night.
so-
And stars.
Yeah,
Stars. That's what
5 and 6 contrast with one another, or 5 and 6 are a pairing in the way that one contrasts with the other.
I think what this does is, I think pretty much, except maybe for the first one. Like, it seems like what this poem is trying to do is exactly what, and pardon my religious mentioning here, but the way in Judaism, what we do is we have the funeral first, and then we have this thing called the Shiva. But the Shiva is more to remember the good times of the person that has passed away, rather than by people will cry, but they'll tell like anecdotes or stories about that person. While the funeral is the time to be sad. It's kind of like the book of Ecclesiastes. There's a time to be happy and a time to be sad, even in the same. And that is why I selected this poem, because it not only talks about how people died in a war. That's how it's about. But the overall message is saying that in death, to remember is to also keep their memories
To continue,
and
yes.
to
Well,
continue even if you don't get to see them again.
It's true in most religions in some way that the soul or spirit or shade, or Egyptians call them shade, and we have smoke is a spirit in Nightwood. That same idea, yes. That's why they go to a religious service. The Christians normally go to a religious service, and then you go to a repast, and you eat like mad, and yes, and you talk all about the deceased and their memories, and you keep photographs, and you keep today videos, and all those things. I think when he was writing, he was just writing in, may apply other places, but the general horror of this mass death of these young men, that they will not be more than 17 ever. They will not be more than 18 ever. Dying in a foreign place, not at home, not with their friends, not with their relatives.
And I think interestingly enough is that Binyon uses the mention of stars. Where did he mention that? As the stars, that the starry night and time of darkness. I feel like
he first brings it up in the 6th stanza, and then it transitions into the main theme for the 7th.
I feel that I always say about stars, and this isn't an exact thing, but it is a common thing that people say, is that a lot of times when people die, the last thing they see are stars. Have you ever heard people say that before?
I'm not sure if a lot of people, when they're writing,
When
they say black.
I should say that when you're in a war,
Oh.
because you're usually dying outside. I've heard people say that stars are the last thing you see.
I haven't heard that, but
I'd have to
remember
read
that
into
the
it.
Greeks and the Romans always translated everyone into the stars. Even Barnes in her Nightwood translates one of her characters into smoke that rises to the stars.
Did you want to say something, Larry?
Not really, and I don't have anything to say right now. I like the poem. It's a good poem. Not sure about the star, especially in the last verse. I don't think I understand what's being communicated. So I'm not sure if I understand this poem enough really to say much.
What I wanted to bring about how the 3rd stanza, which is they went with songs to the battle, they were young, straight of limb, true of eye, steady in a glow. They were staunch to the end against odds uncounted. I think that does a terrific job. I'm going to check the camera.
It's kind of like
It does a great job complementing the 4th stanza.
what you're saying about the 3rd stanza is quite interesting, because it's almost as if dress up, go out to war. We're going to do what we need to for our country because we're fighting for our country, and we're excited to do that, and then play. That's kind of what it's saying. Like, these are young people with energy who are willing to go and fight for their country. They don't know what they're getting themselves into. And when they do,
Well,
they
in some
fell
ways
with their
in
faces to
England,
the fire.
but I don't know that would really have been perfectly true. They just finished the Boer War in 1898. That's the one that Churchill was in. England, as an empire, was at war someplace or defending its perimeters someplace all of the time.
They had so much territory.
I think it
too.
depends on the person.
Europe just was, especially the French and the Germans, they just marched across each other every generation also. But it's the romantic memorializing of the hero and the hint of pacifism that makes most of World War I different, because people just went to war. If you wanted more of anything, you went to somebody else's country and you took it. They didn't have capitalism. They didn't make wealth. They took wealth, like Alexander the Great. He grew up, his whole impetus, or somebody like Julius Caesar, or any of the men of that time, they would grow up to be in the army. They would go to war. It's only in the 20th century that we begin to think that maybe we don't have to do these things this way. That's why the League of Nations, I don't know, its benefits or its whatever.
This is also the one with the trench
that's how
warfare,
this
right?
comes out of
Yes.
this. Yes, this is how this people began to see. When we started mass slaughtering each other, the Battle of the Somme was 10 months for 3 yards of mud and killed 1 million men. That became really horrible, but that's after he wrote this poem. Writes this before, maybe he can foresee this coming, but he writes this before.
And
the
perhaps that's
worst
why
of
the
it's going
poem
to be.
became so
Yeah.
big,
Yeah.
because it was written before
Yes.
the worst of it.
Yes, and it was like a prediction in some ways, because that's what was going to happen. I haven't been to Normandy, but I was to Flanders. I saw the poppies in Flanders, and I saw the graves. They just go forever, forever. It is. They said it killed a generation of men, and it probably did kill
Well,
a
what do
generation.
gravestones do? They help you remember people.
Yes.
They make sure they don't completely
Yeah.
disappear.
Well,
It's
also
Tributes, memories.
It's gotten, I know that cemeteries, it's gotten to the point where it's almost as if they created little cottages out of
in some things, yeah.
cemetery. If you,
We're not as big as it was before. When you go back to the Victorians, they put all the angels and child effigies and all these things, expensive stonework, yes.
I guess it all depends on what you can put into it.
I think it's more about the memory than it is about the stone.
That's what it should be.
My great grandfather, he doesn't have the biggest stone, but when I do go see his grave or when I go see his bench or something, like, it's just something to remember them by.
Is the bench right? He's not buried under the bench, or?
No,
Okay.
they're in two different places.
Okay.
One of them, he's buried in Philly, but the bench is in Ventnor.
Okay.
And the bench is actually dedicated to my
Is it
great
like
grandfather.
it's similar to the
It's on the
ones that you
boardwalk.
find on? Oh, okay. I think because I was down in Sea Isle City, and
Oh,
they
it's not
have,
Sea Isle City.
No, I know it's not there, but they have benches where they have in loving memory or in dedication to
Yeah.
so and so, and then the year they were
Well,
born.
you also have the tradition, Christians don't have, that if you go to the grave, you put the stone on top.
Yeah, we do that.
The monument
Well,
also.
actually, I think with Grandpa, instead of putting stones, we put seashells.
Oh, yeah.
Because
You were at
he
the
used to live
shore.
down the shore.
Mhm.
So when
That's very
he was
fitting.
buried in Philly, we got some seashells, and I think we also put I know you're not a Eagles fan, but we put like an Eagles thing because once he won the Super Bowl, we went over and put an Eagles thing on
If
it.
he's an Eagles
Super
fan,
Bowl
that's
with
what
him?
matters.
Oh, he
Oh,
was-
yes,
he was-
anybody
he was
from
a really
South
big-
Jersey was an Eagles fan.
Well, except for
Not necessarily, but there are.
it depends if you're
Oh,
Western.
Depends.
If you get admired in the South, you can't mention anybody else. It's like being in Boston and talking about the Yankees.
No.
Mhm. I'm a Giants fan all the way, though. We got Giants, Eagles, Jets, and I'm not sure if you even follow football.
So is this poem
Renny.
about the Giants?
This poem was written at a good period in some ways for poetry, like Eliot's The Wasteland and much other written in the teens and the 20s. Literature still did impact us. I can't imagine anyone writing anything today about Iraq or Afghanistan that you would even get it into anything.
Well, there was,
they were published in newspapers. They were published in all the magazines, and people read.
There was Sunrise over Fallujah, which I had to read for summer reading at Cherokee.
Okay. I know that there's prose that's been written about.
Yes.
A redeployment was written about the war in Iraq.
Mm.
Yeah, well, I told you yesterday about the one from Vietnam that was briefly in one of the anthologies, How to Tell a War Story,
Tim
which was
O'Brien.
quite excellent. But it only was in a couple editions, and then they took it out.
Perhaps it's because this was such a a massive shock like World War One. Like
That's part of it.
once you have a lot of wars,
There were country wars, but there had never been the mass of a dozen countries against a dozen countries. That was certainly different.
and of course newspapers started popping up around that time, right?
Their
Newspapers were
newspapers are-
earlier than that.
Yeah,
yes.
much earlier.
They're,
but
they're certainly very powerful.
Yes.
They're very powerful, yes.
I wanted to make mention, I know that you had said something about the first paragraph. I personally felt that the first stanza was very worthy. The fact that it sets everything up and makes it seem as if the people that are fighting and dying in war are a piece of the country, and more so a greater piece of the country for the sacrifice that they put into it. Because you have the mother is England, and the children is all of its citizens, and in this case in particular,
England mourns for her dead across the sea.
soldiers.
Across the sea. That's talking about England.
Yeah, the flesh of her flesh they were, spirit of her spirit, being a piece of her, fallen in the cause of the free, which...
Trying to fight for what they feel is freedom.
Yeah, the fact that they are falling, it allows the country to be free and prosper.
To rise itself.
Yes. But, and it's interesting that they use the word Thanksgiving.
Then it
because
also brings up an interesting question, like, what's more important, the country or the people?
it all depends on who you ask and what you believe.
That's my point. No, you can't agree or disagree on
But
that
this is
question.
taking the perspective that
The country.
the country comes first. So,
Yes, well, it was the empire.
That's-
King and country.
and that's what Binyon pretty much was demonstrating, because even at the age of 46, he was still dedicating his life during the war to help the efforts in any which way possible.
And in a way, that kind of politics kind of evolved over the years, and it really still is basically people over country or country over people. That's usually the two arguments to, and it's interesting that he writes about what happens during that kind of when everyone goes out to fight and all these things are happening and people are dying, but we do remember them for doing what was right for the country.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we used to have much more attachment in a way. I don't know what it would have been like to be a British citizen of the world. I mean, they were the world. The sun never set on the British Empire at the time. But think of our Civil War. Lee would probably have commanded the Union armies if Lincoln could have gotten them, but he went with Virginia. Can you imagine today that you're going to fight because you're in New Jersey? But certainly people did fight because it was for their country, especially during the First World War. And as I say, there is a hint of pacifism coming that is all this exactly worth it in the poem, and that's going to develop out of the poem, not of this poem, but of that time period.
There's granted, the Civil War comes with a lot of its own complexities, because a lot of people make particular assumptions as to why the war took place, what they were fighting for, and the positions that people had in both the Union
Well,
and
this
the
is way
Confederates.
off base, but I'll tell you a story that's connected to my ex-dead husband's family, who was a Burker from a little village in Germany and came over here in 1858 and settled in Illinois, God knows why. Bought a farm, and at that time, if you were here for 5 years and your neighbors would testify that you were a decent person, you could become a citizen. So he became a citizen in 1862. He immediately joined a militia from Illinois and died in April in Montgomery in Tennessee.
Wow.
Yeah, it is remarkable in the sense that he was fighting for Illinois. I don't know that he was fighting for the Union, but there were people that came from all over, walked to fight in that war for the Union, and possibly so for the Confederacy, but I don't know the Confederate side that well, because the winners are the one who get to tell the story.
Mhm. The Union, they won the physical war, but the Confederates won the peace. So,
Oh, I would argue that, but I don't want to do it. So.
yeah, it all depends on how you look at it.
Love
But,
to see how you look at
and
it.
technically, the last battle of the Civil War was Pimento Star.
Oh, well, it's always hard to end. World War One led us to World War Two. World War Two led us to the Cold War. Cold War got us into Korea and Vietnam. We're still, part of our fighting in the Middle East is anti-Russian, because Russia uses the Middle East as a substitute, and so do we. We are, because we are more energy independent, I think we can be less involved in some of that now, which is a good thing.
Yeah, I think that's a positive. But as far as this discussion goes, for the fallen, do we have any final thoughts?
I just say that, I think that the poem is, it's interesting, to hear you guys talk about the timing of it, right? Because it does have that romantic element,
Yes.
of honoring the idea of going off and dying for your country and all that. And I think that's kind of what makes a poem like this immortal, so that it's still, around, like you said, in memorials and things like that. So I would just say that, it's a shame in a way that it seems like the war has kind of become so, what's the word, like, I want to say ubiquitous, but I'm not sure if that's the right word or not. It's like,
It's all over. There certainly are wars all over.
I think
it's just like ubiquitous to life, where it's just like accepted now that we're just in this constant state of war.
Yes, I would hope not.
Yeah, and I hope that we can get out of that somehow. But
Yeah, I think it would be a great solution to be able to solve things more with diplomacy and talking with one another, as opposed to physically harming other people and destroying.
I mean, the unfortunate thing is that there's always going to be fights. The question
Yes, I was
is,
gonna say,
There's
how
people
are
that
you
don't
going to
respond
do
if
it?
you're not
any
going to
other
fight,
way.
it doesn't mean that the other person is not going to fight.
Yeah.
That's the difficulty there.
There's areas where the only way that they'll respond is through violence and termination.
Well, I will say that I thought Ari's point in the beginning was really important, the fact that good literature and the best literature applies in many ways, not necessarily just to the incident that they were written for or about. We do that across the land with the best of everything. It gets to be allusions, it gets to be woven into other situations and circumstances, and then it gets to live on.
in a way, this poem is also a tribute to those soldiers who died but were never heard from again and who weren't able to be buried.
I think that it definitely does a great job depicting all people that have that fought for their cause, and martyrs them as being the young, determined, dedicated individuals that they were. Before we wrap up, I just also wanted to remind you that this is a show of multiple perspectives. So we admire your. I know earlier in the discussion you made mention to bringing in a perspective based off of your Judaism, and we admire that. And I think that you are always welcome to use that as a igniter to point of view.
Yes.
But if you're interested in checking out this poem and plenty of other World War I poems, this is a copy of my book, First World War Poems from the Front. And this has poppies all over the cover, because poppies were
A symbol.
That
a
was a
symbol
symbol.
for the war effort. And it's very, Isaac Rosenberg made mention to them frequently in his poetry.
And if you're interested in any of the stuff I mentioned about, services and stuff, just you can go on Google and type in Yiskor. That's spelled Yizkor. and you can find all kinds of texts and readings about memorial services, and not just in Judaism, but they can also apply to all religions as well. So that's the Yizkor is the service that happens. It's a memorial service that happens 4 times a year on Yom Kippur, Shavuot, and a couple other holidays, where we remember not just one person, but everybody.
Alrighty then. Be sure to join us next time for another episode of The Gladiators. For now, keep reading.
No,